Hello, my name is Frank L. Ludwig. I'm a childcare worker, poet, and autism advocate. You can find this article and all others at autismappreciation.com. I would like to introduce you to the autistic Neanderthal theory, which answers questions in the fields of paleoanthropology and neuroscience that mainstream theories cannot answer, simply by putting aside the ethnocentric worldview Homo sapiens is prone to and interpreting well-established facts in a more logical context. Abstract. Homo sapiens were quite unremarkable until they met the highly sophisticated Neanderthals. Assimilating the Neanderthal led to the Upper Palaeolithic Revolution, since it caused a drastic increase in Homo sapiens' brain size and consequently brought about their rapid evolution by combining the creativity, resourcefulness, and inquisitive spirit of Neanderthals, who were of an individual nature, with the ambition and networking skills of Homo sapiens, who were of a social nature. Since the Neanderthal assimilation, most Homo sapiens have retained their predominantly social nature, and therefore tend to ostracize those of a predominantly individual nature, who, beginning in the 1940s, are being pathologized with the label of autism. However, human progress is driven by autistic individuals because of their original thinking, lack of conformity, immunity to group dynamics and peer pressure, skepticism of authority, and discontentment with the status quo. A person qualifies for an autism diagnosis when they, due to the nature of their Neanderthal DNA and the resulting traits, exceed the level of individuality tolerated by society. The autistic Neanderthal theory is the only unifying theory of autism, since it is able to explain every facet as well as the heterogeneity of autism. The autistic Neanderthal. Many, if not most people, take a very condescending view of both Neanderthals and autistic individuals. Therefore, the initial reaction of autistic people to being compared to Neanderthals, as in Leaf Ekblad's theory, is often that of outrage. However, neither of the two groups is in any way inferior, and there are indeed many indications that autism could be linked to Neanderthal DNA. In the past, most people considered Neanderthals somewhat like a parody of mankind, the hillbillies of the Upper Pleistocene. Today we know better, or at least we should. The bias against them has led most scientists so far to look at the facts and interpret them unfavorably for the Neanderthals. And archaeologists tend to attribute inventions and milestones to them only if nobody else was around at the time. Furthermore, Neanderthals are only being compared to modern humans, who are the result of our interbreeding, and never ever to their Homo sapiens contemporaries, in order to justify the notion of their inferiority. But the more evidence emerges, the more difficult it becomes to portray these people, who happen to have a larger brain than any other hominins, including ourselves, as naive savages. Neanderthals emerged in modern-day Spain 430,000 years ago and spread over most of Eurasia. This coincides with the marine isotope SAGE-11, an interglacial which began 424,000 years ago and during which temperatures in Europe became less hostile for humans. The interglacial lasted for 50,000 years, after which the next glacial period gripped the continent. Even though the physiognomy of the Neanderthals had made them more resistant to cold weather, human life in these conditions would have been impossible without clothes, and an animal hide thrown across one's shoulders simply wouldn't do the trick. Therefore, it must be deduced that Neanderthals had developed the ability to produce clothes as early as 370,000 years ago, more than 170,000 years before Homo sapiens emerged. Neanderthals looked after their sick and old, demonstrating that they had already evolved beyond capitalism, and buried their dead. There are also indications they might have laid them to rest with gifts and flowers. The Shanida cave in Kurdistan is thought to be a Neanderthal graveyard. It appears that Homo sapiens learned to bury their dead from Neanderthals, who already did so at least 130,000 years ago, but who possibly had continued the practice from their direct ancestors throughout their existence. The earliest known burials of Homo sapiens took place around 100,000 years ago in the Kafsa and School caves in the Levant, an area they would have shared with Neanderthals, by a group who preceded the large out-of-Africa migration by tens of thousands of years. They may simply have copied the custom from their neighbors, as well as their Mousterian industry, but there is more to it. Although classified as Homo sapiens in the meantime, they were initially believed to be Neanderthals due to their distinct Neanderthal features, such as their brow ridges and projecting facial profiles. This suggests that these people were already the result of interbreeding, and that his appearance would indicate either assimilation by Neanderthals or their return to Africa due to the cooling climate. The second scenario would also account for the presence of Neanderthal DNA in Africans. Unfortunately, it hasn't been possible to extract DNA from them to settle the question of their species. While vegetables seem to have been a regular side dish, Neanderthals were carnivores who specialized in big game such as bison and reindeer. Many of them lived in the mountains where they cornered herd animals from which they chose their prey. Some of them were also quite partial to seafood, including dolphins and seals. Of course, coordinating ambushes like this requires organization, and organization requires complex language. Fortunately, the hyoid bone was located in a similar position to ours, and their FOXP2 gene was identical to ours, probably thanks to our most recent common ancestor, which means that they not only had the need but also the ability to speak in full sentences, once again, long before Homo sapiens even came into existence. Their stone tools were of the Mousterian class from which they developed the Chattelperronian industry, and they also may have used projectile spears. It seems they produced wooden tools as well, which sadly don't fossilize. In order to attach stone spearheads to wooden shafts or knives to handles, they developed a strong adhesive from the heated bark of birch trees in a technique which has not been duplicated with the resources available to them until 2017, making them the first known people to have employed chemical synthesis at least 200,000 years ago. They lit fires, and while most of the known Neanderthals lived in caves, some of them constructed buildings from mammoth bones. The Neanderthals were artists and appreciated beauty. They adorned themselves with jewelry, ornaments, and feathers and created cave art. Neanderthals are the inventors of string, harps, herbal remedies, the lissoir, makeup, and the world's first musical instrument, the bone flute. In the recently discovered Bruniquel cave in France, in a chamber not reached by sunlight, Neanderthals had constructed two ring structures from stalagmites around 176,000 years ago, demonstrating that they not only were able to build, but also had developed means of artificial lighting. The purpose of the structures is still debated. One possible explanation is that they were built by two families who spent their nights away from the glacial temperatures outside and who built them to protect their privacy as well as to keep the heat of their fireplaces in. Traces of fire on top of the stalagmites also indicate that they may have been used for illumination purposes. It also appears that Neanderthals were the first human seafarers, at least 100,000 years ago. The Mousterian tools have been discovered on Crete, an island that is separated from the mainland by 40 kilometers of open sea, even during glacial periods. With this in mind, it might be worth considering the possibility of Neanderthals having crossed the Strait of Gibraltar into Africa. This would be another possible explanation for the fact that interbreeding of the two species already occurred 100,000 years ago, long before Homo sapiens left Africa, as well as for the presence of Neanderthal DNA amongst African populations. Around 48,000 years ago, when the Sahara became inhabitable and traversable again, the first Homo sapiens arrived in Europe. They probably were already used to killing off any people who were different from them, and it is most likely they had to flee to Europe during the peak of the Ice Age because they had been displaced by other Homo sapiens themselves. Yet Homo sapiens, who had not significantly evolved at that stage, would not have stood a chance against those who already inhabited the area. Neanderthals were physically stronger, familiar with the terrain, had advanced technologies and knew how to survive in a frozen world approaching another low in global temperatures. Fortunately for the newcomers, they were also more welcoming of different cultures than Homo sapiens. Therefore, it is most likely, albeit difficult to imagine in today's world, that both parties established friendly relationships and joined forces right from the start. The Neanderthals would have taught Homo sapiens how to hunt, gather food, build shelters, and make clothes and tools, and the large number of Homo sapiens would have made their hunts of large prey, such as mammoth, more effective. Generally, even in this day and age, and despite the information we have now, Neanderthals are still played off against Homo sapiens when facts are presented, despite growing evidence that they weren't competitors, but collaborators and lovers. We know that all of today's humans have Neanderthal ancestors. Taking into account that the overall Neanderthal population was quite small, it is estimated that Homo sapiens outnumbered them 10 to 1, it is reasonable to conclude that they were entirely assimilated into Homo sapiens, to the benefit of both. Well, maybe not so much for the Neanderthal. Combining the creativity, resourcefulness, and inquisitive spirit of the Neanderthals with the ambition and networking skills of Homo sapiens led to the Great Leap Forward, also known as the Upper Palaeolithic Revolution, an unstoppable force that conquered the world, beginning with the Cro-Magnon culture 45,000 years ago. Around the same time, Homo sapiens also acquired their current brain organization. The fact that all living humans carry Neanderthal DNA does not mean that Neanderthal genes reached all populations of Homo sapiens. It merely proves that only populations with Neanderthal DNA survived. It appears that Neanderthals saved Homo sapiens from extinction. Considering that modern humans, due to the Neanderthal assimilation, are entirely different from the misnamed extinct pre-contact Homo sapiens, it might be time to rename the latter in order to distinguish them from others, maybe as Homo socialis. Assimilating the Neanderthal caused a dramatic increase in the brain size of Homo sapiens. However, after the last Neanderthal had been assimilated, Homo sapiens only had each other to reproduce with. This has led to the ongoing gradual decrease of their brain size since the Cro-Magnons. And while some scientists say that size doesn't matter unless mine is larger attitude, others are concerned about this. There are many aspects of Neanderthals that are reminiscent of autism. They prefer to live in very small groups that had little or no contact with each other. They had a significantly larger occipital lobe, which gave them greater visual and pattern recognizing abilities, and they were less social than Homo sapiens. As Clive Gamble pointed out, we have a social brain, whereas Neanderthals appeared to have a visual brain. They had larger brains, came up with original solutions to problems they faced, and smoked and dried meat, which they probably stored to live on until the next herd of big game came along, corresponding to the common autistic trait of hoarding. The study of mirror neurons is still in its infancy. Mirror neurons are present in all primates and are responsible for our abilities to imitate and emphasize with others. However, in autistic persons, these neurons appear to come with rationality and privacy filters. While non-autistic people tend to copy an entire action, regardless of the necessity of the individual steps, autistic people tend to leave out all steps they know to be superfluous. And while they have the same, if not a higher, sensitivity to the sufferings of others, as well as their own pain, they are less likely to express their emotions and share their feelings. As it is impossible that millions of autistic individuals independently develop a new type of mirror neuron, the cause must be sought in the past. I propound that the differences are a result of separate developments after Neanderthal and Homo sapiens split from their last common ancestor. The Neanderthals lived in one of the coldest environments imaginable, and even though their physiognomy helped them to adapt to the climate, the conservation of energy must have been a major concern. Therefore, the performing of unnecessary actions would have created an evolutionary disadvantage. Imagine a father showing his sons how to kill a deer and dancing 10 times around the carcass before slicing it up. The son who cut out the dance in his own hunts would have had a better chance of survival, and that's the reason the Neanderthals developed the rationality filter. In the meantime, Homo sapiens became more of a social creature and started sharing their feelings with others, a trait that was not present in the last common ancestor and therefore not in Neanderthals either. Furthermore, eye contact, which tends to reduce people's focus, is considered a sign of aggression by many primates, and it is likely that this applied to the last common ancestor and Neanderthals as well. Amongst Homo species, the use of eye contact as a social tool beyond the purpose of threatening and asserting dominance is probably unique to Homo sapiens. However, in competitive environments it is still used for exactly this purpose. Also, Homo sapiens appears to have developed a filter to ignore sensory input, which the Neanderthals lacked. And while Homo sapiens back then, just like modern humans, were of a social nature, Neanderthals, just like autistic people, were of an individual nature. Although our lacking social nature is considered a disorder by most, it brings with it an increased ability for independent and creative thinking, what is called thinking outside the box, recognition of patterns, spatial intelligence, attention to detail, focus, skepticism of authority figures, immunity to peer pressure, group dynamics, and opinion packages, and a lot more. All the properties that brought mankind out of the Stone Age. In his solitary forager hypothesis, the author argues that this autism advantage may have been useful in the past. However, mankind would take a great leap backward if these abilities were to disappear. As I pointed out in one of my articles, it's our failure to conform to society. It's our failure to think the way others think. It's our failure to subscribe to group dynamics and groupthink. It's our failure to give in to peer pressure. It's our failure to blindly follow tradition. It's our failure to unquestioningly obey authority. And it's our failure to accept the status quo that have driven human progress for tens of thousands of years, thanks to autistic individuals who successfully resisted attempts at being mainstreamed. The more children are conditioned to suppress their autistic identities and subjected to conversion therapies such as applied behavior analysis, the more the potential for future human progress is being reduced. If autism were eliminated, as some people wish, mankind would enter a period of stagnation, followed by permanent severe regression. On the other hand, just imagine what the world could look like if autistic people were accepted and given equal opportunities, enabling them to develop their full potential for the benefit of all. Neanderthal DNA, besides possibly that of other archaic humans, being the cause of autism and related neurological orientations would mean that we all are indeed, as some people claim and science has demonstrated, a little autistic, on a spectrum that ranges from extremely social humans to extremely individual ones. We all have inherited different genes from the Neanderthals. The type and combination of these individual genes and their manifestations, and whether they are deemed acceptable by society, will determine if we qualify for an autism diagnosis or not. The autistic Neanderthal theory is the only unifying theory of autism, as it explains why there is not a single trait, that is present in all autistic individuals. Now, a few words about how the theory developed. Around 1980, having studied Neanderthals and ancient humans, I concluded that the mysteriously large brain size of Cro-Magnon humans and the subsequent great leap forward must have been the result of interbreeding with Neanderthals, who had the largest brain size of all hominins and who lived in Eurasia at the same time. However, even if I had been in a position to publicize my theory, nobody would have taken me seriously, since scientists back then categorically believed that the two species weren't able to interbreed. 2013 till 14. After realizing that I'm autistic, I tried to figure out what exactly autism is by looking for something all of us have in common. However, I had to find out that all of us are entirely different from each other, more different, in fact, than non-autistic people are from each other. And eventually it dawned on me that autistic people have a predominantly individual nature as opposed to others' predominantly social nature. During my research, I also came across Leif Ekblad's Neanderthal theory from 2001. Yet, since he only pointed out a few similarities, he failed to convince me, and so I didn't pay too much attention at the time. 2017. An article about Neanderthals, which pointed out that they were more advanced than formerly believed, rekindled my interest in them. Almost 4 decades after first studying them, I now had the internet, allowing me to locate more information than I could as a teenager. The more I read about them, the more I noticed similarities with autistic people, in particular their individual nature. At this time we knew that interbreeding had occurred, and I proposed that Neanderthal DNA must be responsible for the individual nature of autistic people. Still, scientists only claimed that all people outside sub-Saharan Africa carry Neanderthal genes. I tried to find out how many sub-Saharan African populations didn't have Neanderthal DNA, but couldn't source any information, and research centers didn't reply to my emails. I addressed this point in a paragraph. 2020. A study was published which demonstrated that the amount of Neanderthal DNA in African populations had been largely underestimated, and that all living humans carry Neanderthal DNA, thus eliminating the elusive sub-Saharan exception. Thanks for listening. As I mentioned before, you can find this article with all the sources and all my other writings at autismappreciation.com. See you.